Very, very warm welcome, everybody. Welcome to tonight's conversation. We've been doing a series called Conversations on Pedagogy. And tonight we're pretty excited to be having a conversation with, I just think, someone who's an incredible, remarkable thinker, an author, an educator. Jill, welcome to our kōrero, as we say here in New Zealand.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah, we found some common links actually when we talked last. We noticed that we're both big, huge fans of Elise Schaefer, who's the Pedagogical Institute of Los Angeles, and people at Conscious Collective deeply love what they're doing with refugee, providing early childhood centers for refugee communities, and that work. And also Elise is just a phenomenal thinker. Yeah. And Jill, you sent me this beautiful book, which I've had such a joy in reading, and you're a co-author. That is something, to be an author, to be a co-author. It's a dream, I think, of mine once. The process of writing a book, what was that like?
Oh, it was a long journey. One nice thing about the book is Claire is both a colleague and a dear friend. We actually went to high school together and then ended up both in teaching, and so our lives have woven in and out of each other for different reasons. So it took us 10 years to write that book, to be completely honest. So some of the stories go back a long way, but we just loved learning together. And I think in some ways the book is a result of our wrestling with beginning teaching and the highs and the lows of all of that. And it probably is the evidence of many conversations of trying to figure out how in the world to keep going each day and how to do it joyfully and with hope. So it's a lovely, for us, I guess, personally, it's a real celebration of a long-standing friendship, but it also captures something of our hope that we share in teaching. So I think writing it together it adds a nice flavor to the book, because I think you can get the sense of our dialogue through it, or I hope you can. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's hard to tell when
I felt that, and I felt the bouncing off each other's worldviews kind of intertwined in the pages. So what was the inspiration? Did you guys have a chat? Kind of, has it always been something that you wanted to share? Was it the dying message that you felt needed to be?
No, not initially. We had a lovely situation. I think it was over 3 or 4 years we ended up teaching in the same school. And she was teaching in the what we call kindergarten, which is our 6-year-olds, and I was teaching the next level up, I guess, so the grade 1s or the year 1s. And so we, over those 3 or 4 years, we shared a lot in our experiences working with a similar group of children moving through. And at the time, we were given the opportunity to host some professional learning within our own school staff team. I had the chance to go to Reggio Emilia with the school principal at the time, and they were a set of schools that had really inspired Claire and I. And so as a staff, we decided what would it look like to really wrestle through some of the big ideas. So she and I would get together and kind of pull apart a concept and map it out and then bring something to provoke the staff together. And we did that week after week, and we just loved it. And it created just some really deep thinking amongst the team. And it was actually the teachers at that school that said, you guys have to write this down. We needed to capture it somewhere. So we actually ended up, both of us, resigning from which is a bit sad, because it was one of our favorite, I guess for me, it was a really favorite time teaching in such a collaborative environment. But we ended up moving from that role to give ourselves some time to write the book and to actually kind of try and capture some of these stories and try and make visible what it looked like for us in practice to think differently about what life could be like in a school. So in that context, we were particularly in the early years of school, trying to bring some life and joy and I guess what did it look like to be alongside children and have them want to be there, and it not just be a compliance kind of factory where children were just blindly following us. We really wanted to engage with their thinking and their learning. And so the book captures some of those stories, I think, and there's certainly a lot of stories in there from the early years of school, but the nice thing about it taking us 10 years to write it is that it then gathered up some stories from other settings that we worked in after that. We ended up having time to sort of feed through some different other situations. So yeah, that's where we...
what I love about the book in particular, and there's a lot, but and we'll delve into this a little bit, is that you write, there's an element of context that you write in terms of the lens through which you're seeing the world, but then you have these beautiful conversations that you add in here where it's just word for word, and I'm not sure if people might be able to see that, but you know, stories as you've captured them, as children are theorizing about the world, as they're making sense and meaning. So you really take the reader into your classroom and sitting next to you as you listen to unfolding. It's beautifully written, and I do love that it's written. A lot of the books that I've kind of encountered that has inspired me when I've danced around with the educators from Reggio has either been from an American lens or from Italy, from Reggio itself. And so it's interesting. It was an interesting lens through which you saw in your encounter. And I know that for you, the Reggio thing, and we spoke about it a little bit, it's an interesting dance because you know, people want to be Reggio inspired, and they want to do Reggio at their place. And you have, and many others who have encountered the approach have quite a different view on what that means. I wonder if you can kind of just straight away just delve into what that means for you.
Yeah, it's a really important thought, actually, and it was something that we considered a lot as we wrote the book, because there is absolutely no doubt that the provocation of the educational project in Reggio Emilia has significantly influenced both Claire and my thinking as educators. There's no doubt at all. We have a great debt that we owe to them, and I think we try and capture that within Unearthing Why. But I guess it's interesting that you say that. At the time that we were working with the school I mentioned earlier, we were looking at our philosophy, and maybe the story of that will capture the essence of what you're going after, I hope. But we were talking, we had this kind of aha moment, you know, when you're in a struggling and pushing and pulling and sometimes it's a messy conversation. And I think that's something that me and Claire both love, is a bit of mess, a bit of uncertainty. And I think you need that if you're going to get anywhere worth going. And we were wrestling through our philosophy. You know, what does it actually look like to say this is who we are, this is what represents us as a school? And this idea of philosophy in a box came up. This idea of, did it look like, you know, our philosophy was in a box and we had to fit everything into the box that was who we were and how we were going to function, and it just felt really constricted. And someone, I don't recall who, but someone in the conversation provided this idea of, what if our philosophy was more like a wheel? And they said, you know, what if it was a wheel in the sense that it had momentum and it didn't have to stay in one place, but it had structure and it had elements to it, but they were elements, and the elements were the thing that actually drove the practice, and they drove us in terms of moving forwards and always moving forward. And so, funnily enough, we didn't actually end up implementing that as a part of that school's philosophy, but it was a metaphor that really stayed with me. And in that context, I saw Reggio Emilia as a spoke within that wheel, but a very significant one. But it wasn't who we were. It was something that was grafted in a way of thinking, a way of moving us forward. It provided us and continues to provide us with really important questions. Sometimes it slows us down. Sometimes it brings things into greater clarity. But a little bit equally inspired by Reggio, we wanted to make sure that we were open to multiple perspectives, not just seeing Reggio as some sort of prepackaged, finally we found the way. Actually, what inspires me most about Reggio is that they don't see themselves as a way, that they don't see themselves as having arrived. They don't believe that there is an answer today that's going to last until tomorrow and the day after, and that we're finally going to be able to package this thing called education up. And so I think that's what's so ironic, is the way in which we try and package Reggio is so counter to the actual philosophy and the thinking behind the work of these amazing educators. And so we've tried to emulate that, giving honor and recognizing the significant influence that they have played, but also recognizing, as they do, that there are many thinkers and many ideas, and there's a long history in education, and different cultures and lots of things that influence who we are. So I guess, I think when we spoke the other day, the other metaphor that's really helped me is the idea of a lens. And as you can see, I'm a glasses wearer, but if I take my glasses off, I'm still aware of what's around me, but it's not as clear. And I do find that the language and the stories and the theories and principles that come out of the educators in Reggio Emilia, the theorists, the pedagogical leaders, really helps me to clarify my own thinking. It's been really important to stay in that place of conversation with them. I don't know, is that similar for you, Rick? What's your story in relation to that?
Yeah, it's I'll come to that in a second. I think you touched on something around people are so, they want a mythology. They come going, okay, give me the way that I have to teach. How do I have to turn up in the morning? What does a setup look like? What question do I have to ask? And how do I do long-term inquiry learning and projects? And so it's a very methodical, if you do this, you get this result. And the essence, I feel that the conversation around Reggio and broader in some of the presence-based education space, I suppose, is to listen deeper, to stay in mystery within the approach, to feel intuitively into the relationship, and to plan into whatever emerges in front of us that is holding the curiosity of the teacher and the child. And that's very, even though some people might listen to what I just said and go, well, there you go, there's a method. I think that's a way of being, and that's a way of it looks different for every person. It looks different for every context, because it's very much place-based, relationship-based, community-centered way of being with people.
Yeah. So much more about who you are than specifically what you're going to do tomorrow. Because if you go into tomorrow knowing the kind of stance that you want to have, then you're open to any sort of action, right? It's about, am I open and available to what's happening in front of me? And I think that makes the possibilities endless in terms of how we actually behave and respond, because we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. So you talk about holding the philosophy. You talk about the metaphor of a tree, with the philosophy and the why being the roots of our practice, and really understanding, why is it that we teach? What do we believe? And how do we want to hold ourselves as we walk into this encounter with the other and the children? And then and you'll be able to explain it much better and succinctly than me, but this is how I've read it and heard it and thought about it. And then the how seems to almost organically grow from the nutrients of who you are. So the how of the practice, what it looks like as an example, comes because you're really grounded in knowing who you are, why you do what you do, and what you believe. And so the tree grows above. And that's what people tend to want to see. They want to go, oh yeah, I want to be able to build that really awesome tree. But they are sometimes, maybe we haven't done the work to really understand what's going on underneath the surface. Yeah. I think too, whether you spend time thinking about your why or not, it's still going to inform your what and how. So I can either be, like, as you say, very intentional about knowing what it is that I bring into the work that I do, or I can do that by accident. And I think what Claire and I are inviting people to do is not let your why be an accident, not let what drives you be something that goes without being questioned, without being brought up out into the open. And one of the reasons we really liked that metaphor of the whys, because often it is invisible, like the roots of a tree are often invisible. They're often the things we take for granted. They're often the things that we don't talk about. When we compare ourselves we can fall into the trap of just looking at what's obvious, what's above the surface. And I think I can't speak for someone else, but I think sometimes our tendency can be to look for what's similar in each other, to compare each other above the surface. So if you looked at you and I above the surface and you looked at our practice, you might find, oh, actually Rick does this and Jill does that, and would they be able to work together? And, we could go through a whole level of comparison. What would be interesting, or maybe to me more interesting, is to go below the surface and actually go, well, what is actually driving Rick as an educator? What's actually feeding his decisions, his what and his how? And sometimes we find that two people can have the same why, but very different what and hows. They can actually have a different answer to the question. And so that, I think, probably partly because we ended up as early childhood educators working in primary schools, this was a really important metaphor for us, because there was this kind of mythological divide between these two age groups and these two settings, and we had to navigate that. And funnily enough, the tree metaphor came from a conversation over a glass of wine when I was chatting to Claire. And I grew up and was raised in Canada, and in Canada basements are quite common. And I remember saying to her, this primary early childhood thing, wouldn't it be nice? It's like we're two houses on the same street and we're right next to each other, but we can't work out how to get into each other's rooms. We just can't work out how to connect. And I remember saying just off the cuff to her, what if we had a shared basement? Wouldn't it be cool if you could go underground and we could meet underground? And it's just not as pretty a metaphor as the tree. Can you imagine if we'd have done a whole bunch of houses with basement all through our book? But anyway, I don't know. It kind of sounds. So we adapted the metaphor a little bit, but it came from that idea that frustration, I guess, of how do we build spaces to connect? And actually, we found when you only connect around what I do or how I do it, and we only meet in that space of that next layer of decision making, that often that leads to conflict. But if you get a group of teachers to first meet in the soil, all of a sudden they understand each other's what and how better. It doesn't mean they come to agreement necessarily about what they do or how they want to do it or what tomorrow looks like, but our experience has been there was more dignity in that process. So a great example is a dear friend of mine, and we taught side by side at a different setting a few years back, and she and I were both in leadership roles in the school, and our how and our what was different. It didn't look the same, and there were aspects of my practice that didn't suit her, and vice versa. But when you go under the surface, what we realized working together is actually we shared massive ground underground, and actually often the same passion for excellence, the desire for authenticity, the importance of children being celebrated for who they were. All of those drivers were the same, but because we had different backgrounds and different training, that we were looking at it, and our what and our how was different. So I guess in some ways, wouldn't it be amazing if we focused on connecting underground and we gave more room for different kinds of trees, that we didn't all have to look the same. So
absolutely. And how do you think you start to uncover your why? Because it tends to be quite hard to be self-aware, I've noticed.
It is hard, yeah.
To try and kind of understand the patterns that's driven you, the energies, and all those beautiful things. What's your process been, or how have you managed to kind of connect to it?
It's a really good question. I get asked that a lot, actually. I should probably spend some time and get a better answer. Every time I hear it, I go, oh, that question again. I should have gone away and thought about it again.
You should have prepped for this one.
Good level of conviction. It's not the first time I've been asked it. I think two things come to mind immediately. The first thing is fairly basic, but I think sometimes it's just asking each other. You can either ask yourself this, or you can ask someone else, is why did you decide to become a teacher? That's a really healthy, good question to ask. And it's amazing how many years you can be working with a team of people, and you might never have given a session of time, like a couple of hours, a whole staff meeting, to just say, tell us your story. Or what would it be like if every time we met as a staff for 2021, one person shared their story about why they want to be a teacher. And I think sometimes that unearths things. I think the other thing, which might seem counterintuitive, is sometimes we find our why when something contradicts it. So sometimes I recognize what I care about when someone disrupts it, when they actually act in a way that's counter to my values. All of a sudden my values surface. So if I'm going on day to day, it maybe is just operating quite silently in the background, but when something happens that counters what I value, all of a sudden, so the next time someone, I'm just thinking of educators who might be listening to this, I'm just thinking the next time someone does something, or if you're working with someone currently who just gets under your skin, or you're really frustrated, I always think there's a gift waiting in a disruption. There's always a gift waiting in a frustration. And if you can get past the offense of that moment and put that to rest and actually go, what is this speaking to me about who I am and what I'm bringing into the room? And what is it that, where are my boundaries being crossed? And where do I need to actually, become skeptical of what I'm carrying, but also it might help crystallize some of those things. But they're just two things. I probably really should give some more time to that. But yeah.
You speak a little bit about encountering the other, and I think you talked about letting the stranger be the stranger, and or you have more interesting. It's a way of thinking that I've really been delving deep into. Is how do I, kind of like leave my own beliefs, or what would I say? It's like a suspension of disbelief when I encounter you. Can I just for a moment get rid of all the thoughts on how you should be and why you should believe like me and why I'm right and you're wrong, and actually see you for who you are? Where does that kind of come into your life or in your thinking, and what role does that play, do you think, in the educational approach?
That idea of welcoming strangeness, and that idea of letting the other be the other, came into my life through reading the work of Emmanuel Levinas, a philosopher, at a time when I was doing some study. And it fascinated me. This idea, I'm not really an academic. So if you're an academic, just give me a little grace here. But, this is what I took from it anyway. My impressions from reading his work was that there's this tendency within humanity to look for the same. So you and I have just recently met, we immediately found a connection in Elise Schaefer. We're looking for overlap. We're looking for where are things that make it sound like, how do Rick and Jill go, yeah, you're someone who I want to connect with? And often it's around the things that are the same. But Levinas challenges about what happens if we then, because the more I get to know you, Rick, the more there will be otherness in our relationship. The more complexity there is, the more connection there becomes, the more complexity, the more otherness there's just inevitably going to be there. I mean, you only have to be married thinking you're the same, and then 5 years later you go, wow, we're actually kind of different. So that's, it's just in any kind of relationship, there's so many layers. And so there was this invitation to let the other be the other. Like, what would it look like in a conversation to really be like, exactly like what you just said, to be able to stay in that moment with another person and let them just be themselves fully. And honestly, I'm not a rock star when it comes to actually applying this, but it was something that really I felt challenged by, and I wanted to give energy towards. And then this idea of welcoming strangeness, not avoiding it, not being afraid of it, but actually when you see something that's strange, leaning in rather than backing away. And I guess it also speaks back to the title of the book, Unearthing Why. And I think you will hear people say that why is a bad word. Don't ask why. Why is, really confronting. And certainly in Australian culture, and I think it depends on how you ask it, but certainly going up to someone and saying, why did you do that, can actually come off really critically. But I think there's a possibility where we can actually reintroduce those kind of questions into our professional conversations, our relationships with other educators where we actually give permission to ask why with a different kind of spirit behind it, where it's actually about actually what I saw today left me muddled, I'm uncertain, I'm uncomfortable, can you bring me into that, can I lean into that rather than shirk back and back away from you? What does it look like to actually say, can you tell me why you made that choice so that I can understand that better? One of the reasons I think that's so important, but I think you need to give permission ahead of that moment. I think if you just went in tomorrow and did that to someone, they'd probably go, what's your agenda? Why are you doing this? So I think as we go into next year, oftentimes groups of educators will meet together. It's a really beautiful opportunity to actually say, can we give permission for this year? Or how are we going to do this year? When I'm on, say, so if you and I were working together saying to you, Rick, there are going to be moments this year where you're going to do something or I'm going to do something and the other one's not going to be comfortable. How are we going to handle that? Like, what do you want? How do you want me to approach you? Because I don't want us to just push it under the carpet. But if you can decide that together before that moment happens, it's a long way towards that end result. But the reason why that question is really important is for both parties in a conversation like that, when we better understand why we've done something, after that's thoroughly understood, or as much as we can understand one another, then the question becomes, is there a different what? Or is there a different how? Can we reimagine? And my experience has been, if we can connect around why, we become more flexible with what and how, because we get firmer in the ground, which is why the tree metaphor actually does work really well, because we know that of trees that the deeper their roots, the more stable they are above the surface. And so we need to invest time in that stuff, in those conversations.
We tend to see that once I understand the why, I'm going to become a little bit more free to let you kind of wonder and play in your own lane, trusting that whatever you're up to, we're kind of on the same path. Our end destination, we'll kind of meet in the same space, but I'm kind of intrigued to let go of control and let you be you. So I can definitely relate to that. I want to come to talking a little bit about the content of the book, and in particular, what I'm really interested in, you wrote something here which just really resonated with me. You said, when you see a different child, we become a different teacher. It's such a fundamental idea, and the whole book, I feel like that sums up the contents of what you're seeing and how you're trying to portray what happened. So help us kind of understand how the image of the child impacts how we teach and who we are as teachers.
Yeah, it's huge. And perhaps that idea, I'm just thinking of those listening who might not have heard that phrase, the image of the child. It's probably unlikely, but that idea of that coming as a provocation from Reggio Emilia, this idea that our idea of children is something that's been socially constructed. So we have certain expectations that we bring into our relationships with each other, but also into our relationships with children. I think it's important to say that generally too, because it's actually often our image of humanity. What do we believe about ourselves? And so as powerful as our image of the child is in informing how we teach, is how I see myself. So what do I believe about what it means to be me, and what it is to be in the world and to be human. So the massive questions. I think that perhaps most simply, or it's always so hard. It's funny because the image of the child can come off like a really simple concept, it really, and yet if the more you plumb into it, the deeper it gets. And but I do think sometimes simple examples help to hook into it. So the one that is coming to my mind is, if we see children, the very obvious one is, if we come into it thinking that children come into school or into any educational setting empty, waiting to be filled, that's the very common discussion way beyond contexts that are interested in Reggio Emilia, talk about that idea of we really need to consider how, if I think of a child as empty and I'm the person with all the stuff to fill in their bucket, I'm going to act in a certain way. Whereas if I see a child coming into my classroom or my early childhood setting with competencies that are already in action and being developed, and my role then becomes to enhance and to support and bring my strength to strengthen them in that, then I'm going to act in another way altogether. So, I mean, yeah, it's a tricky one. It's so important. But it's hard to be concise about.
Yeah. So you talk about going from like seeing children as writers to seeing them as authors, and I think that switch for me was like, oh, this is a really great example of just the lens through which you see a child. The one is like a writer that has to do some stuff to get it out, and the other is an author and a storyteller and a creator.
Yeah.
And so holding the space for children to be to live up to the incredible kind of curiosities that's within them.
Yeah. And I mean, all of these things that we've turned into curriculums and key learning areas, I don't know what you call them in New Zealand, but, you know, we've packaged all this stuff up into these boxes that make us feel like we're more in control, but really to hypothesize, to theorize, to experiment, like this is part of the human condition. You know, we see things and we want to discover. And I think that what children remind us of is that actually to be human is to be curious, you know, it's to be a question asking person. And I'm often encouraged by what I see in children to reactivate and reawaken aspects of my own personhood that sometimes get lost because we get all too serious and boxy as adults. And so I think even that idea, I mean, children as authors is my favorite chapter.
Give us a little bit of insight into your thinking there.
With that chapter, you mean?
Yeah.
I just love the metaphor generally, not just about, like, I love the idea that what would be the difference in how I lived out tomorrow if I saw myself metaphorically more as an author in the world than as a reader. And I think sometimes our education system has taught us that we're meant to read texts and replay them, you know, and we're meant to follow scripts that have been set for us. You know, our families have scripts, they have roles that they've placed us in that we sort of feel like we should follow in line with. But what if actually I have agency over my own storyline? What if I actually can rewrite my story? What if I can author the text of my life? And I love that metaphor. So, I mean, I love it because I love literacy. I love books. And the stories talk about those things, but I kind of love it. We started the book with I am an author, partly because we wanted to launch with this idea of taking ownership over these dispositions, these ways of being human, these ways of understanding the world that are actually available to the youngest of children. And I think the authors chapter really captures that too when we talk about learning to speak, that the desire to communicate, to connect, this use of symbols, gaze, all of these things that are so crucial to us becoming very effective, literate people are actually, we see that from birth. And so it's just reclaiming that space a bit and saying, yes, absolutely. As a teacher, I want to be able to pass on tools and ways of being able to communicate in new and different ways. And if I have tools in my tool basket for that, of course, I want to do that effectively and bring them to children in meaningful ways. But the whole point of it still is to be a communicating person, to be able to connect with others. And I think my heartbreak is when I speak a little bit about this in the book, but, you know, when I have seen children who at 3 and 4 are just fascinated by text, are fascinated by meaning-making symbols. They're amazing communicators, but then they hit this world of very traditional approaches without any meaning to teach letter sound correspondence. And I love phonics. I'm quite fascinated by it, but I certainly don't think it carries a lot of meaning if you teach it in isolation. And so it's, you know, I think both Claire and I would be quite passionate about saying, let's not throw out meaning. This is actually crucial because I don't want my children, if I think as a mom, I don't want my kids just growing up to be really effective at filling out forms. You know, I want them to write stories. I want them to compel people to, you know, think differently and do different things. And that's a lot more than letter sound correspondence, you know.
And this idea that children have a voice and that they get to exercise their voice and that they can create in the world and that their subjective reality matters. To a degree, and not to a degree, and it's full. And I think there's this flow-on effect. You talk about children as philosophers, you talk about children as citizens, and this is what I've deeply admired in my encounters with great educators who value children with let's call it a strong image of the child, is that just by sitting and listening to the children, they're able to capture the moments and allow them to be and give them significance where they're starting to make these meanings and communicate in ways. And when they then are able to run with it, then magic happens, and great long-term investigations or short-term investigations might happen. But essentially there's like a little pearl of wisdom that just comes out that you're able to follow and co-construct and co-design curriculum rather than prescribe or
it goes back to what you were saying before too about, you know, you were talking about how do you stay in a conversation or in a relationship and let the other be the other. I think sometimes with children we jump in too soon and presume we understand what they're talking about, you know, and I think it would do wonders for our teaching if we took more time to slow down and actually ask, just say that to me again. Like, what did you say? Did I understand you correctly? Like, how often do we do that with children? Do we clarify and make sure we clarify their meaning, you know, and instead of just assuming that I heard it the first time and I understood what you were. And that's where your why gets revealed too, because we often assume we understand what a child is trying to communicate to us based on our own experience of the world. But the child standing in front of me has an entirely different world. You know, they have a totally different experience. So I think we need to become skeptical of presuming we always get what's going on in front of us. And so slowing down and checking in.
Embracing the mystery in a way, the unknown, kind of being okay with, often I find that when we're present with children, our mind wants to deduce certainty. It wants to go back to like, I know what you're saying, and I know where I'm going with this project. Woo! You know, like you've just given, or I know where the curriculum's going to go because, man, you just gave me some gold. And I'm not sure. I think it's in your one of the pages. I'm just trying to where you said that. What was it? You were.
The Bridges story. That's the one.
Tell me that one. That one probably might be it.
I don't know if that's what you're thinking of. There's a great story in there that was totally humbling about me being in a moment, presuming in a sandpit that I understood what a group of children were doing. And I thought because all they were talking about was bridges.
That's exactly
is the story? Yeah. And I was actually in my third year prac, and we had to do a documentation assignment. So I had to find research with children, right? So that's always a great recipe for disaster. And so instead of seeing the children in front of me, I was looking at everything through, is this worth documenting, right? Like, what damage does that do to our pedagogical presence in the room if all I'm seeing is this worth documenting? Like, we have to ask ourselves, you know, is that what we come to, that we're just looking through that lens? So that was the lens I was in that moment. I was just looking for something that I could turn into an assignment, really. And they were all talking about bridges, and the bridges they were making in the sandpit were beautiful, and I could take really good photos, and I knew it was going to look great in my assignment. And I went home that night like a very good prac student, and I stayed up late and I printed off pictures of, you know, bridges and spent all of my budget on color ink and just thought this is going to be so worth it. And I got in the next day and sat around at the table of this preschool, and I asked, beautiful phrase that I learned from Leslie Ostenfeld, who was the director of that preschool. She used to always go up to children and ask if she could borrow them. And I thought that was a really interesting what and how that came out of her why, that she didn't think that it was just her right to have children when she wanted them. And so she would go and ask, would it be okay if I borrowed you for a moment? I can see that what you're doing is important, but could I borrow you? And they actually had free choice about whether or not they could go or not. So there's a little bit of a why informing action. Anyway, so I dutifully followed in her footsteps and asked to borrow them. I was doing everything right. And they sat around and I'd spread out all these beautiful pictures of bridges, and they just wouldn't even talk to me. They just looked at me like I was annoying, and they were probably out of respect for Leslie. They came and sat at the table with me, and it just went nowhere. And I was so disappointed, but I was kind of annoyed at the children, to be honest. So I was like, oh, that was just very uncooperative of them. But anyway, I kind of moved on and started looking for something else to document. And at the end of the day, we were cleaning up in the preschool. And I think this shows an extraordinary and a very different style of leadership. I don't even think Leslie would describe herself as a leader, but she taught both me. Claire and I both serendipitously ended up on a prac with her at different times. And it's just one of those interesting serendipitous sort of things. So we've both been influenced by her amazing teaching. And we're cleaning up the tables, and I was probably wiping down a table, and she just came up nearby, didn't make eye contact, and just said to me, why didn't you follow them to the city? And what she had heard was they weren't not talking to me. They just weren't talking to me about bridges. And because they kept talking to me about the city, I kept changing the conversation. I kept going, no. Thanks for telling me about the city, but I want to talk to you about the bridges. And she, even from a distance, could hear them. She was really listening. And she just asked me why didn't you follow them to the city, was I think the question she asked me. And she didn't say anything else. That was it. That was the end of my professional little slap, in a good way, the best kind of slap, but it was a good one. And
that's so beautiful. That's I think most people can relate to that idea of coming prepared, thinking that this is going to be good.
So much work went into those.
I can't wait to ask the children and have our small group, and we're going to go deep in this, and then there's just zero interest.
Yeah. Have you heard that? That reminds me too of Carla Rinaldi's, with the pedagogy of listening, but one of her statements that just stays with me and constantly instructs me is, you're not really listening unless you're willing to change your mind.
That's beautiful.
And that's a powerful statement. Like, am I really listening if I am not entertaining the possibility that what comes out of your mouth would alter me? If I'm not willing to concede that you could change me by your speaking, then I'm just giving you airtime. I'm not really listening. So I think that openness to be changed by the other is something that can happen by accident, but I hope to be more intentional about that in my practice, making room for that.
And there's a Maori concept called ako, which is that the teacher and the child, and my understanding doesn't go as deep as what I love, but are both learning from each other. We are learning from each other as we go. That the teacher, the child is the teacher, could be the student, could be the teacher, the child is the teacher can be the teacher. That role swaps and moves fluidly through time and space. And when we come to view the world saying that I am the expert, I'm the one with the knowledge, and I'm going to lead my team in the knowledge, and we're going to create a really beautiful approach because I've done 7 years of study and I've been to Reggio 7 times, and I am it. We tend to get so the lens through which we see becomes very one-dimensional. And I think that it's almost like the more we know, the less we know. The more we tend to kind of accumulate, the less we tend to really have the place for the other. And I think if we can really examine ourselves in the areas that we think we're an expert in, and see if we can let go of the stronghold of the ego in those places, to really come and listen and say, well, how can I be surprised again? How can I see what I haven't been seeing? How can I view the blind spots?
Mm-hmm.
How can I just sit and be quiet while everyone else tries to figure it out? Because I tell you, this is the hardest lesson I've had to learn in my life,
Yeah.
is to sit there while other people are figuring it out. When you know what to do. I know how to do it. I know how to fix that. I know where we're going to go. I've been here 17 million times. And to sit in that moment and go, how am I learn? What can I learn from this? How can I love that, listening to change. How can I change my mind? How can we go on an unexpected journey that leads to more beautiful outcomes as well?
Yeah, and familiar territory is the most important time to do that, right? Because familiarity is not helpful. I mean, it's good in some ways because you get a sense of collegiality, you do all that, but sometimes we get too familiar with each other and we make a lot of presumptions that we understand where people are coming from, and we make up. I love Brené Brown. I love her work, and I love the part of her work where she talks about what are the stories you're making up in your head, and we often are making up stories in our head about what other people are thinking or why they behave the way that we often make up each other's whys. And we do that from our own perspective and our own experience. And oftentimes we are missing and miscuing, and we don't even think that we are. I was talking to someone not long ago, and they were so certain that they understood what was in the mind of the other. And I was like, wow, I've made too many mistakes in my life to make that mistake anymore. Like, I've stuffed that one up plenty of times. And in actual fact, I think it's important to let that go, that I know what's in Rick's mind, because I don't know how you're experiencing this conversation. I don't know when we turn off the live feed what happens in your world. I don't know those things, and so I'll come up with a story in my head about that, but I need to acknowledge that it's a story in my head. Like, I'm not living your story. And so I don't want my next interaction with you to be based on the story in my head that happened between our conversations. I want it to be about the actual relationship that we're building,
It's a lovely thing to take away from this conversation, is just to go and just the recognition that I don't know you. I haven't encountered you fully. Whoever you are there, I've seen you through a lens, and to let those kind of like presumptions or assumptions down, and just to sit and spend quality time to truly listen to someone. And it's both exhilarating because you do you then enter into that wonder of discovery again, like co-discovering. You're like, oh wow, the relationship almost feels fresher, and it's not because the other person has changed. It's because you've let down the familiar stories that you've told yourself about that person, and now you're able to see them again, almost like not for the first time, but there's almost like that feeling. And that's with children and with adults.
Yeah. And I think also it recognizes that I don't fully understand myself. I sometimes I wish I understood me more. And so the last thing I want to be is in a relationship where the person sees me on my, Tuesday at whatever time it is right now and decides who I am from this conversation, and that's all of me, because that's not the case. So, it's also, I think the more safety there is, the more permission there becomes to not have to decide who each other is as a result of an encounter. Gives me more freedom and you more freedom, hopefully, to just be who you are the next time we meet, So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
As we kind of come towards the latter half of the conversation, I've been curious to ask you a little bit about two things. First thing, and we'll, just a short kind of understanding of what you've been in early childhood, and now you are part of pioneering. It sounds like a pretty amazing school at Blue Gum Community School, or you're an educational leader there, and you're setting one up in Sydney, from what I understand. But that's full primary, and is that going to go up to high school as well? Or
the Blue Gum Community School in Canberra, who is the tribe that I have been adopted into, it goes from a playgroup with babies right through to preschool and up to year 10 in Canberra. The site in New South Wales that we are setting up is going to just be, at this stage, a preschool and a primary school on the site. It's not a site that's big enough to go beyond that, and we had to start somewhere. So
it's exciting, and I'm looking forward to be able to come and see you at some point when we've got all the planning consent sorted.
Yeah, wouldn't that be good?
Yeah.
I keep hoping. It's just me in an empty house at the moment. So, yeah.
You talked about the divide between early childhood and primary, and it seems that you've bridged that gap somewhat in the current community that you're in. How is it different? How is teaching in a group of children, let's say 3 to 5 year olds, different for you to teaching with 5 to 7 or 5 to 8 year olds?
Well, I mean, I don't think it needs to be that different. I think what's interesting is we have these artificial divides in education, but we don't have them in families. So in my family, I have a 7-year-old and an 11-year-old, and they're great friends. You know, they think and play together all the time. They're different. They're dealing with different things at different times, but there's no sense of us needing to define them differently. I think that great teaching is less about the age of the person in front of you and more about the presence that you bring into that. I'm thinking off the top of my head, so don't hold me to that. But I think that there are different priorities. I think sometimes when I'm with a 3-year-old, I would say they might have different priorities than an 8-year-old. You know, if I think about the 3-year-olds and the 8-year-olds, I know. So they're definitely not the same stage of life. In the same way that if I talk to a 21-year-old and I speak to a 60-year-old, they're different stages of life. You know, I think it would be wrong to say that we're all the same. We're not. But at the same time, every 3-year-old doesn't have the same priorities and the same way of doing things. And so we can sometimes accidentally think that all 3-year-olds are like this and all 8-year-olds are like that. So I think being in an environment that doesn't put as much emphasis on the age or the stage, but actually is more about knowing the child, it allows for us to bring both our knowledge of those big, Lise is actually the person who talked about this. I probably won't get it right, but when I heard her speak in Perth, she spoke about the value of looking at, you know, for the age group that you're working at, what are the big ideas? What are the big concepts? What are the big questions that we tend to see repeating themselves over and over again? Because that's actually quite instructive for us. So if we know the kind of big concepts or what the social, you know, it's quite common when you're working with children who are 8 or 9, they start to push back differently in different ways, and or they might be quite fascinated with certain topic areas that seem to really capture that stage of life well. I don't think we want to throw that out. I don't want to leave that. I think we have to have both and in this kind of situation where we hold on to the value of experimental prints in preschool, and we recognize that that's something that we see at a certain age at a sort of time, and that we need to have instructional strategies around how to support that. But at the same time, that we don't sacrifice knowing the specific child that is in front of us. And also being able to see those cross-age relationships. I remember, I mean, it's so funny, it's probably not a big enough of an age group to really be a legitimate story, but it's a nice story. But my son was in a preschool class when he was there for 3 days a week. And he had a great friend. And the next year he went into the 5-day program, and it was in the same setting. And all of a sudden he never saw his best friend who was in 3-day because that child decided to do another year of 3-day. And I remember walking in one day and him saying to me, "Why can I never see my friend? Like what happened?" You know, and it was just out of the mind of a child. He was like, where's the invisible line that said that the 3-day children and the 5-day children never will meet again? You know, and I mean, if you and I were, oh, it's crazy. Imagine if you were working in the same school and you and I were friends, and I was teaching in a different space, and someone said, "Oh, that's it. You know, no more. You can't see Rick anymore. He's in another hallway." Like, anyway, it just reminds me of this. I think we need to just bring into question some of the lines in the sand that we have drawn. And ask, and that's a really good example of why as well. So I think it doesn't mean we throw it out. But for example, assembly in a primary school, I mean, I think it's really good to look at that word. Like, what is the word assembly? What does it mean? Why do we use that word to talk about bringing a group of children together for a purpose? Is that the why? Like, so when it was called assembly because it was the assembly line and it was the factory, there's our history for that word. But I don't think it means at the end of that conversation that you have to throw out the word. But I think we do have to understand the words that we use and reimagine them. So we might still have stage-based classrooms in your primary school, but you might understand more about why you're doing that or what. So I sometimes think we think that when we question something, we have to change. I think sometimes questioning something helps us to solidify the decisions that we're making and make those decisions with a greater level of integrity, if that makes sense. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I suppose the final question I want to ask is I think it was Leslie who you were referring to her, and she said, and you said intentionally building context where children are motivated, encouraged to think, speak, question, engage with the other in a regular, rich, and thoughtful way. I think it was something that you picked up from how she was able to be with children. And a lot of context that I've observed, we struggle to kind of get the rhythms and the rituals right to build this intentional space where children are encouraged to think and talk. And how have you seen that? How do you create those environments where children are there rituals and routines that help you do that through the day, or is it really just being an awake, aware, present teacher?
Maybe it's both. I think it matters how we listen in the moments that don't matter, in inverted commas, the moments that don't matter. Like, so how I greet a child, how I welcome a family in the morning is as important as the discussion around a circle about the great research project that we're trying to unpack with a group of children. And I think sometimes teachers will hope to sustain really rich conversations with children at just this one moment in the day. Okay, this is our research moment. We're going to all come around. I want to know about your theories. I want to know about your hypotheses. But I think Claire and I speak in the book about children being the great human authenticity radars of the world. And my experience is that if you don't listen to children when they care about the conversation, they won't engage at the same level of depth when you start asking the questions. And so I think that the culture we build in the moments maybe that don't matter to me, but matter to children, are where I'm building that relational trust, and I'm investing in that conversation. I also think, this is touching on this way too lightly, but I also think that when we document and we retain children's conversations and we come back to them the next day, that we're slowly in our culture saying, I'm listening to you. And I don't think it's in the book, but there's this amazing story from when Claire she resigned from the school that we were in before I did. And I remember bumping into one of the children in the playground. I don't know if I was on playground duty, and they were crying. And I said, are you okay? What's happening? And sat down alongside this child. And they had just heard that, Miss Britt was leaving the school. And I said, yeah, that's really tough, isn't it? Because she's a really special person. And this child just looked at me and said, yeah, but Mrs. McLachlan, who will put our voices on the wall? And she messed me up. I was like, well, I don't know. But I thought, what a powerful image of the teacher, that this child saw Claire as the person who put her voice on the wall. And that didn't happen just because Claire listened when Claire was interested in the conversation. That happened because Claire was available when that child needed a listening person. And I think, so I think if we want to, because people will often say, well, how did you get the children to say those things? Or, I've never had a conversation like that with a group of children. I think it's because we listened on the other times, and oftentimes I've never actually looked into it, but oftentimes I find some of our richest projects are actually happening in terms 3 and 4, because we've spent so much of the earlier part of the year building trust and culture, and the children go, I think by term 3, they're like, yeah, they're with us. They care about what we think. They come back to it. When I say something today, they ask me about it tomorrow. And I mean, that's a really powerful thing.
Yeah, I can almost sense, even as we're speaking, in my body and my heart, just how special a place that is for a child. To know that whatever is intriguing to them, the adults are listening. They're wanting to know what I'm saying. They're actually going to co-construct and walk alongside me, push me a little bit when I need to kind of take this the step of faith, get curious when they don't understand what I say, document this journey for me so that my mum and dad can also join in to my wanderings at school, and we can build this community. It's a very different place to how a lot of children experience school at the moment. It's a hopeful place, and it's a place of relationship, and a place that of community, and a place where we were able to, I feel like coexist in a really healthy way.
Yeah, it's a human place, isn't it?
Yeah, human community. Jill, it's been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. We've
it's a total joy, Rick, to hang out with you online.
Absolutely. Now, the book Unearthing Why, where can we go to get a copy?
You can buy a copy on my website, which is thecuriousteacher.com. You can also buy it at Early Childhood Australia. Radio Australia sells it. I've decided, and I'm happy to do it until I go to bed tonight, but I've made New Zealand shipping free for until tonight. It's a little bit expensive to send it to you guys, and I didn't want that to be a discouragement. I can't afford to do that permanently, but I am very happy for anyone who's engaged in the conversation today. If the book is of interest, get on to my website today and you'll be able to buy it for just the cost price, and I'll cover the shipping for you tonight.
Thank you so much, Jill. Appreciate that. I look forward to, once the world return to normal, to hang out in person. I'm sure
Wouldn't that be nice? That'd be great. Nice.
But thank you for your time, and have a beautiful evening, and we'll catch up again later.
Okay, nice to chat. See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.